First of all, thank you so much to our colleagues and friends at the University of Georgia for inviting us to be here today and to present and to provide a forum for DJ to present his very interesting, complex generative work. DJ and I have been working for several years now when he was a student, and now that he is a doctoral candidate, on finding a topic that was a source of both passion and personal commitment for him. And after several iterations, I think he made the very brave choice to examine his own experience from more of a communal lens. And I think what we have here is an extremely complex phenomenon that he's done a wonderful job, a very sensitive job at sort of capturing many of the nuanced political, social, human, ethical dimensions to it and how they're all entangled in this very fluid notion of identity, and how we care for people as they're transing from throughout their lives. And I think he's captured the sort of process orientation about becoming and never really fully formed. And I think it's a really good fit for the work of the lab that seeks to study, generative dynamics in a very complex world. And so we're very pleased to be here to provide DJ a forum to share his very rich work, and hopefully to ask for some feedback as he proceeds from conceptualizing a study to actually implementing it. So we're viewing this as an opportunity for DJ to kind of share his ideas, but also to receive the feedback that's going to move him forward on his doctoral journey, but also in making what I think is going to be a significant contribution to our fields and to our society more broadly. So with that, I want to introduce DJ. DJ Ralston, a doctoral candidate at the George Washington University in an organizational learning department, and so much more. But I think you'll learn about that as he proceeds through his presentation today. So thank you.
And sorry, DJ and Ellen, I'm sorry to interrupt this, but I know that there are several people who want closed caption. I have no idea how to do that. I don't have the power. So either Young-Hyun or someone else who has power, I would love for you to do that for us.
I think the host needs to do that, and I do not have host capacity.
So I'm not seeing it as an option, but good news, folks. I have the most updated version of PowerPoint, so I can leave the captions on PowerPoint as I do a screen share as our workaround, since if they were disabled on the back end of Zoom, which I suspect might have been the case here, you have to go in and re-enable them on the back end of Zoom, and it's not something easy to do in meetings. So I will just plan to share them via PowerPoint.
Thank you, DJ.
Yep.
And we'll make a note to go in the back end and figure out how to turn it on for our lab Zoom.
If you need help, I have instructions. I created them for the HOL faculty a couple of years ago. Happy to send them.
Please, DJ. Yes, please.
As Dr. Scully-Russ said, this is a presentation on my dissertation proposal in progress, which has long been coming. The title, the working title at this point, Clapping Back, Navigating and Surviving Trans Antagonism and Neoliberal Precarity Through Transing Care. Like I said, I'm DJ. I'm not talking about any of my other roles today. I'm here purely as a doctoral candidate, representing myself and my own views and research. And Dr. SR has bravely decided to be my chair, though sometimes she might regret that. So I want to start from a place of talking a little bit about positionality and language. And you might be going, why language? But language actually, and I'm going to start here. Language is really important. In fact, I literally was just doom scrolling this morning and several of the, trans activists and folks that I follow have been talking about recently what's going on in the New York Times. The New York Times has recently come out, kind of in favor or on the side of trans folks and the quote unquote trans debate. But therein lies a problem. We're framing it as a trans debate when there is no trans debate. I'm sitting right in front of you, and to my positionality, I'm sitting right in front of you as a trans man. So language is really important. For that reason, I feel compelled to kind of talk about it and give you some key definitions on the next slide, which we'll go through. But before I get there, so positionality from an epistemological orientation, so where my theory of knowledge comes from, really, I think is some kind of blend of social constructivist, post-structural, in that, basically I believe that knowledge is conceived as partial. It's situated, it's endlessly deferred, it's circulating through, among, and cross relations. I think of it as, it's subjective and constructed via perceptions and interpretations, as understood through the historical and sociocultural influences and the context of those social interactions. So what I'm really saying is, I basically think that there's no objective truth out there, right? Everything kind of happens within the context of relationship, and it's never really complete. It's always an ongoing process. From an ontological orientation that is being in the world, I also take a more constructivist approach. I would say nothing about me is clean and neat. Nothing about me is very categorical or even binary, even though I might now identify as a binary trans man. So this kind of just goes to that, right? Multiple realities exist, realities constructed in conjunction with others, socially through our lived experiences in human interaction. And ultimately that like one's subjective reality is influenced by the historical and cultural norms that are embedded within one's lived experience. Okay, that was a lot, but we're going to move on from there. So like I said, I feel really compelled to just talk a little bit about language because language is so important and it really does matter. And there is nothing more evident than that right now, considering the landscape of trans antagonism, which we're going to talk a little bit about. But we need to remember language is contextual. It's influenced by our time, place, and sociocultural conditions, which is why it's such a shit show currently for trans people. And yeah, I know I just said that. That part will not make it into the dissertation, but it can be in the transcript. Really, language evolves and changes over time. We all know that. It varies across communities because communities are not a monolith. And guess what? Trans communities, no exception to this. I am one trans man with one experience as a trans man. So as we think about this study, we're really thinking about, the variety of trans folks that are out there, right? It's not just about me. So let's just kind of break this down. Transgender and trans colloquially is understood as people whose gender is different than their sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned at birth is typically predicated on the presence or non-presence of specific genitalia, quite frankly, which really tries to simplify biological sex. And guess what? It's not that simple. We're going to leave that alone. Everybody really pretty much here probably knows what transgender is and what trans is. Those words are kind of used interchangeably throughout. Let's talk a little bit about transness. What is transness? Transness is really, it's really about referencing kind of the wide-ranging assemblage of different embodiments, practices, expressions, and experiences that comprise the ongoing existence that occurs in living as transgender. That was a lot of words, sounded like word salad, but basically what transness is who we are through living, right? And it's really about the different forms that our embodied genders take like throughout that living, all right? Transing. Transing is an important concept to this entire dissertation. So I'm gonna spend a second talking a little bit about it. So transing really is the practice, and it's really the practice of employing transing that is to cross, how do I want to think about this actually? So to quote Stryker, it's the practice that assembles gender into contingent structures of association with other attributes of bodily being and that allows for their reassembling. So in other words, transing functions as a disciplinary tool when there's stigma associated with the lack or loss of gender status and threatens social unintelligibility, coercive normalization, or even bodily extermination. it can also function as an escape vector or a line of flight or a path towards liberation. So when we start thinking about the context of care, which we'll get into, and we think about this concept of transing care, really what we're thinking about with transing is that line of flight. It's that vector away from looking at traditional models of care, and specifically models of care that are really geared in a cisgender heteronormative way, which I'll talk more about, and getting away from that, recognizing that cisgender heteronormative logic of care doesn't apply to trans people. And we'll talk about why that is. But transing is really, it's the act of moving away from or across or in context and through something. All right, and I'll explain more of that later. I'd be remiss if I didn't explain transing also in the way that it's currently used in our colloquial, like in our colloquial setting, and that's that it gets co-opted by trans exclusionary radical feminists, along with, or gender critical feminists, as they're sometimes called, along with predominantly conservative Republican demagogues who say that people like me are transing the kids. As in, we are actively going out there and making kids trans. This gets wrapped up in accusations around being pedophiles, groomers, etc. So transing in this concept as an academic, we are talking about it as an academic process or like a heuristic, if you will, and the act of employing a very specific heuristic. Whereas transing in mass media and social media refers to something that is not great. Finally, transgenderism, just say no to transgenderism. All right, transgenderism, it actually started as an in-community word, but it is, again, been co-opted by those trans exclusionary radical feminists and gender criticalists as a way to purport that those of us that are transgender are just a gender ideology, that it's nothing more than gender ideology, that we're essentially masquerading as you know, what we're not. So we don't use the word transgenderism within the community anymore. And I feel like it's all over the news, so wanted to make sure that people understood that that's not something we're gonna talk about. And if you find yourself saying it, you please pull back and maybe come talk to me. We're going to talk about trans antagonism. We're going to talk about neoliberal precarity. We're going to talk about care, neoliberalism and care, and transing care. And I realize that these are a lot of big words, but I promise we'll get through them and I'm going to break them down. I want to start from probably one of the most salient quotes that I have come across, both in my experience as a trans person and thinking about what it is to be trans and living through being trans, especially at this current moment in time, as well as one of the most salient and relevant, I think, ideas or concepts to this study. And this comes from Hill Malatino, who is a professor at Penn in the Women and Gender Studies program. And his work's actually the basis for my dissertation. But in his book, Trans Care, he says, whatever being trans is about, it's decidedly characterized by upheaval and emergence into a social world with shifting and shifted parameters. For many of us, surviving this process means committing to forms of healing that are unthinkable, indeed impossible, without care webs. And there's a couple of things I want to key in here. One, that whatever being trans is about, living as trans, living through being trans, it's really about an emergence into a social world with shifting and shifted parameters. I cannot stress enough how important this is, especially as we look at the heightened levels of trans antagonism that are currently occurring. But it's like the goalposts are constantly moving as a trans person, right? We've had for decades, or for at least a decade, right? We had some really great progress, but about 5 years ago, starting in 2020, we started to see the introduction of a lot of anti-trans legislation, and we started to see a really targeted approach to a targeted trans antagonistic approach to looking at trans lives. So trans antagonism, what do I mean when I say that? Well, trans antagonism really is the coordinated campaign of both figurative and material hostility, right, that we're seeing all over the place, that's underpinned by the deliberate use of both disinformation and misinformation to foster anti-trans sentiment and justify attacks on transgender people. Trans antagonism is at an all-time high in the United States. And, I think the headlines kind of say it all, right? So when I say that it's at an all-time high, what I'm really talking about is that in 2024, there was more than 600 anti-trans bills introduced with more than 120 anti-trans bills pre-filed for 2025 before 2025 even started. The current sociopolitical climate really, it routinely involves politicians and leveraging mainstream and social media to perpetuate stigma against trans people by referring to us as pedophiles and groomers, mentioning that idea of transing earlier that's used colloquially, right? There's been so many executive orders. The Trump administration on day one literally put out an executive order about, defending women and gender extremism and ideology. These orders have specifically sought to curb the rights of trans people very explicitly, replacing all references to gender with sex, defining sex as only two sexes, either male or female, biologically based at, well, I could critique the shit out of that, but I won't. It's crap. But basically saying there's only two sexes, male or female, based on biological sex at birth. They've removed all references across government programming, websites, documents, forms, etc., to transgender. They've moved to restrictability of being able to change your gender marker on your passport to be reflective of that, of your gender idea, of being able to change it on your social security card, et cetera, real ID. They've moved to restrict gender affirming care available to individuals aged under age 19. Mind you, that also includes 18-year-olds. And last time I checked, age of majority in the United States was 18. You were considered an adult. You can, at that point, buy cigarettes and, join the military. So, but again, looking to restrict that care, restricting transgender athletes from being able to compete in women's sports, denying gender affirming treatment to transgender prisoners, and requiring that incarcerated trans women be housed with men. There's been a number of other executive orders that have sought to also, or would also have impact. They include like the rollback of DEI. They include the repeal of protections that the LBJ signed in 1965 relative to employment support or employment protections, et cetera. So again, like there's so many things that are happening right now. And so the reality is that trans antagonism, it is largely coloring the landscape of many of our lives and lived experiences. And by extension, we now understand that most, if not all, trans people have experienced intense forms of either interpersonal or structural violences as a result of their transness. So that trans antagonism that I was just talking about, the restricting of IDs, the restricting of bathrooms, the restricting of healthcare, those are all examples of structural violence that I, as a trans person, and other trans people are experiencing. When we talk about interpersonal experiences, we see as a lot of trans folks coming out, they experience varying levels of familial rejection, which can range from, strained familial relations to and partial abandonment to like complete and total rejection and severance of all family ties. That right there, that's an example of those interpersonal, violences that folks experience. For trans folks who don't experience interpersonal violence stemming from that natal or familial rejection, many others, we experience forms of interpersonal and structural violence in response to our transness, such as discrimination and exclusion when trying to find employment or access to health and or mental health care. And this leads to further marginalization and increased experiences of poverty and homelessness, which also, again, are kind of indicative of the heightened precarity that a lot of trans folks face. So trans folks historically have always experienced heightened levels of precarity due to the longstanding, prejudice and discrimination, particularly as it relates to how trans people challenge sex and gender, and particularly the gendered roles that make up much of our sociocultural understandings and sociocultural imaginings and logics. So the thing is that more recent rise in visibility of trans folks more recently has really galvanized the politicization, that is a word I cannot say, of the trans population in ways that are previously unmatched. So, listen, throughout history, trans people have always been kind of discriminated against, have been discriminated against, have experienced stigma, et cetera. But, in the last 10 years in particularly, we talk about 2014 as the tipping point, right, of visibility. That's when, Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine, and literally the title of that article or that issue was like the trans tipping point, right? Last 10 years, kind of the increased visibility of trans folks has really drawn attention to us. And, as of about 5 years ago, we became a really big target. Prior to 2020, there had only been a few pieces of legislation, and really the last time that we saw trans people under attack was shortly after that trans tipping point, when we think about kind of HB2 in North Carolina, like as the grandfather of the bathroom bills, right? And if you recall what happened there, and if you don't recall, I'm going to tell you, what happened there was North Carolina passed that bill, and basically the city of Charlotte started to lose so much business, right, that they ended up repealing the bill. People exercised their economic, ability there, and they repealed the bill. So really, we hadn't seen this level of kind of attention until about 2020. And now, as we know, we're all over the news, we're everywhere. And it is creating precarity or generating precarity in ways that, like I said, are previously unmatched. So when I talk about precarity, what am I really talking about? I'm talking about the disproportionate exposure to injury, violence, death for certain segments of the population, in this case for trans folks, right? That results from the systemic government divestment and social safety nets and the exclusion from mainstream social and economic networks produced by certain political economies, namely neoliberal capitalism. And all of my friends, my fan club, thanks groupies, who are on this know that like one of my favorite things to do in my pastime is trash capitalism, because I'm fundamentally anti-capitalist. Perhaps I should have said that about my positionality. But the reality is for trans folks, as a result of inability to access healthcare, things like that, the inability to maybe find mainstream work because of prejudice, stigma, etc., we are often predisposed, if you will, to injury, to violence, to death, to poverty, to homelessness, etc. So to say that the trans population currently faces disparate levels of precarity when we consider the current landscape of trans antagonism is really a gross understatement. So one of the areas where those disparate levels of precarity that trans folks face is most evident is when it comes to matters of care specifically. So what do I mean by care? Because most often when we start to think about trans folks, and if we're like really just kind of living on the surface of transness, meaning you might know a trans person, maybe you don't know a trans person, maybe I'm the first trans person you're seeing live and in person, right? The reality is when you think about care and trans folks, people typically think about medical care or health care, and specifically gender affirming care. Gender affirming care is kind of the conglomeration of practices that include mental health care, as well as health care, and kind of the medical technologies that can support trans people in finding alignment between their gender identity, their sense of gender, and their embodied experiences. All right. But when we talk about care here, I'm talking about a much broader context. I'm not just talking about, gender affirming care or healthcare. I'm talking about care as a multifaceted concept that has multiple meanings with no single definition. All right. And so ultimately, when we look across the literature at all of the different ways that care has been studied and conceptualized, I think basically what I've come out with, right, is that care is best conceptualized as like kind of this tri-dimensional understanding, and that care is a type of material work or labor, as in a practice or a praxis. It's something that we perform. Care work is things like the mothering or the parenting that parents do, right? Changing of diapers, preparing of foods, running of carpools, or being teenage Uber drivers, right? It's also the care that it's the shopping for a friend after they've had surgery, right? It's the caring for maybe an elderly parent, right? Like care, that's what care work is, right? Care is also a disposition or an affect, right? It's a feeling about or towards someone or something. Often we say, I care about you, I love you. That is an idea of care. I want to, I have these very specific feelings about you. So that's kind of the second dimension of care. And then the third and final dimension is really a sort of political ethics or a virtue, depending on what political lens or theory you're kind of looking through. And so I'm taking a more feminist approach to looking at care. So I think of, political ethics or virtue really as a feminist democratic ethic of care that assumes that human existence, that care is central to human existence, and that humans are naturally interdependent and we need care throughout our lives. Now, one of the things that we can look at that across kind of these three dimensions, the thing that they hold in common really is that they're all examples of relationality, right? So material work or labor is something that happens in relation. It's something that we do for someone or something else. It's something that we may be a receiver or a provider of, right? Same thing for having a feeling or a disposition, right? That's something that happens in context with relationship, whether that's another person or an idea or a concept. Like it is something that goes back and forth. And finally, same thing when we think about those political ethics or virtues, it is something that happens in context of relation. For without relations, we have no ethics, right? We also know that care is pluralistic. This kind of goes along with those ontological and epistemological stances that I took earlier about, kind of there's multiple realities. We know that care happens in multiple aspects, etc. Care is contextually situated. Again, kind of aligning myself there with some of those beliefs. And when I say that it's contextually situated, we understand that care both happens in space and in time. We also understand that care is influenced, right, by the sociocultural kind of imaginings and logics, if you will, in terms of how it unfolds. Care and political theory. So as I said, when I think about, I kind of mentioned, when we think about care ethics, right, or virtue, that kind of dimension of care, that really depends on the political theory or lens through which we're looking through. And for me, care is central. Like when I think about care and political theory, what I think is kind of entertaining or ironic, if you will, is that care is central to both our existence and our survival. And this is true to varying degrees across our lifespans, right? Like we in the disability field will often talk about how we're all kind of only temporarily abled. So we know that there are folks that have different care needs, right? Across varying degrees, whether you're following a more like standard development, quote unquote, and I don't even like that terminology, but the reality is we need care to varying degrees, which by extension means we're naturally interdependent. We are not born giraffes. We do not stand up 2 minutes after we are born and off we go, right? Like we need ongoing care. So care is a vital facet of human society, one without humanity would cease to exist. Yet most Western political theory, which serves as the central basis for how we organize society, only implicitly includes notions of care. All right. And this is neoliberalism and capitalism, right, as it's enacted, economic imagining, is no exception to that rule. And it's kind of funny. I had a note here about how we could harken back kind of the disregard for care all the way back to Aristotle's Politics, because he asserts, right, that care is something that happens in the home, so therefore it belongs in the private domain, whereas issues of politics, morality, social organization are things that happen publicly. And so that's where we see that. And like beginning of the public-private divide. And one theorist, Toronto, actually argues that this was done intentionally, right? Because this allowed the extension of rights to some and not others, in the sense that for the things that happened in public, those were things that were happening with predominantly white cis men and basically overlooked women who were in the home providing that care and enslaved individuals. And that really is kind of the beginning or the beginning of the institutionalization of extending rights to some and not others. And we continue to see that play out today. And so when we think about neoliberalism and care, and we think about neoliberal capitalist logic. So when I think about neoliberalism as our kind of overarching philosophy that is guiding, or kind of underpins American society, and capitalism as its economic imagining, right? At their core, these things work together and they emphasize competition, productivity, and profit over collective welfare. I think we're acutely discovering that in the US right now, for maybe folks who didn't recognize that earlier. They work together to champion an archetype of the independent, autonomous, self-reliant, hardworking, and competitive individual as virtuous in that paradigm of morality. This is another key piece, right? There's a moral framework that neoliberal capitalism kind of employs, right, in order to to keep that status quo. And that's when we think about what are the virtues are. Those virtues, when I talk about, care ethics and care being central to our existence as the center of our ethics, whereas like when we look at an interdependency, right, and dependency, and thinking about that as kind of our ethical base, When we look at neoliberalism, it takes a very different approach to care ethics in that it sees that its virtues are really around self-reliance, autonomy, hardworking, competitive individuals, kind of that rugged individualism that we see playing out in a very toxic way today. Neoliberal capitalist logics also actively constrain the role of government. They ensure that to ensure optimal market conditions. This is really a means to further reinforce those sociocultural logics positioned as morals of autonomy, the right to private property, independence, and personal responsibility. So kind of what I just said, right? We need that moral framework in order to ensure that we can uphold, the free market and the market as the arbiter of all, resource allocation and distribution and solving of fights. They work together to systematically pathologize dependence and disable social safety nets in favor of privatization. It follows, right, if we're going to constrain the role of government to not provide any social support or because the market is seen as the best arbiter of all disputes, of course we're going to privatize. And in doing so, it actively devalues that importance of care, undermining any forms of care that don't actually serve to propagate profits and further grow the market. This in turn enhances that public-private divide that I, mentioned harkens all the way back to the beginning, right? Where we place care in the home because it's something that occurs in the home and we gender it. So, which #spoiler, right, gets us to some of the underlying assumptions about care that we find within neoliberal capitalist logics. And that's that care's rightful place is in the private domain as opposed to issues of citizenship, morality, and politics, which rightfully belong in the public domain. And again, like I said, that was done intentionally. Caring as more natural for those individuals, most frequently gendered as women, as in the people who possess a uterus and the reproductive capacity to carry and birth a child and therefore are better suited to do the work. All right. That is a huge underlying assumption. And this concept of naturalizing is something that's really difficult for us to fight back against. And I think any good feminist recognizes and understands that. And therefore, by extension, or what follows from this is that because caring is natural, it is its own reward and therefore does not need to be compensated well, if compensated at all. And I am certain that I know a number of women on this call who I have had conversations with over the years who are constantly doing huge amounts of care work that is unremunerated, not compensated, and that quite frankly is often not even acknowledged. And that's a problem, and that is something that is absolutely perpetuated by these neoliberal capitalist logics. So caring is commensurate with the final assumption here is that caring is commensurate with any other good or service and is able to be regulated by the free market. All right, so these assumptions now help to inform what are sociocultural imaginings of care. So we have all these logics, right? And then we have the assumptions that kind of underpin those logics. And then those logics now inform our imaginings. So when we think about the American hegemonic sociocultural imagining of care, God, that's a mouthful and that's so academic-y or academic-ish. So really like the predominant model of care in America, like cultural model of care that is undergirded by these neoliberal capitalist logics, positions care as a private burden, one that is actually rooted in a cisgender heteronormative logic. What the hell do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is it relegates the responsibility for care to the nuclear family. And the nuclear family in American culture is one that has very specific gendered roles that includes a man and a woman and their children, with the woman providing all of the care, labor, and work, right? So that is when I talk about that cisgender heteronormative logic. It's where men are in the public sector, women are in the private sector, and you can be like, yeah, but DJ, women work now. Yeah, listen, all you women on this call that work and have families and or even partners, like, because remember, we always think about family with children, but I'm talking about any family, right? You all are doing so much of the work, I can guarantee you, that is part of that gendered expectation, right? So here's the thing. Being trans has long been at odds with the moral, ethical, and gendered roles and behaviors that are stipulated by our dominant sociocultural collective ways of doing gender, that is living through, right? And having a gender, living that gender. And thus we're often at odds with those cisgender heteronormative norms and principles that emerge from those collective ways of doing gender. This is especially salient when it comes to matters of care, and particularly the responsibility of care labor. If we think about neoliberal capitalism built right on the backs of this unremunerated care labor, because we know, right, I've made the argument that care is central to our existence. We can't, deal without it, which means it has to occur. And because care has been relegated to the private realm and is not, compensated, there is a whole economy. And this is what a lot of the feminist care ethicists have focused on, right? Is like the fact that there's this whole care economy that if we actually had to pay for, right, our entire social fabric would fall, and sociocultural and economic fabrics would fall apart. All right. So trans people, because we buck the gender system and we buck gendered roles, right? We are perceived as a challenge and therefore as a threat. And because of that, that serves as the justification, or that is maybe the provocation for the trans antagonism. And that trans antagonism, as we talked about, contributes to these heightened levels of precarity. And that's particularly evident when it comes to these social cultural imaginings of care. So my problem statement, or my proposed problem statement for this proposed dissertation study, is that our sociocultural imaginings of care that situate both access to and responsibility for care within the nuclear family are particularly problematic for trans individuals. And this is due to the high rates of transphobia, familial rejection, abandonment, and/or partial abandonment, which are often the byproduct of the current anti-trans or trans antagonistic sociocultural, sociopolitical climate. And this serves to only further reinforce the heightened precarity that trans people face. So in response to this, what has happened is, in response to these disparate levels of precarity that the trans population faces, is trans people have been forced to learn how to navigate meeting their care needs across their life domains through transing care, and as a means to survive. So transing care, which was theorized and introduced by Hel Malatino, who I quoted earlier, right, who kind of kicked off the session, that quote about, shifting and shifted parameters. Transing care is the process of actively engaging in the continuous weaving and reweaving of webs of care across one's community, particularly in, among, and through the interconnected networks of the trans community via an assemblage of embodied and enacted material practices. I want to call attention to a couple of things here. One, the continuous weaving and reweaving, because just as I talked about earlier, relative to kind of my idea of knowledge and being as something that's relational and always partial and kind of ongoing and continuous, that's the same concept here, right? Like that's what I understand transing care is about. Like weaving our webs of care and reweaving them is because we often face ambiguity, we face precarity, we're facing complexity that requires that we, be able to weave and reweave these webs, understanding that we are wholly left out of the mainstream social and economic networks, right? The other thing I want to call attention to is that this is done via an assemblage of embodied and enacted material practices, all right? This is not just one thing. These embodied and enacted material practices that comprise transing care, which I'm going to break down over the next couple slides, include the communization of care, the practices of mutual aid, trans-ethical wisdoms, and infrapolitical ethics of care, and trans for trans, or T for T, praxis of love. I think, too, I just want to kind of call out that, part of what's paramount in that understanding of the weaving and reweaving and the assemblage of these practices together is that it's done in a way that's not prescribed, but that responds to the fluctuating care needs at hand, right? So what's more is it's not a single one of these practices that is, this concept of transing care, but it's it's not a single one of these practices necessarily that make life livable and possible and survivable for trans folks, but it's really the amalgamation of them, and that this is an ongoing and fluid fashion because our need for care is always in flux, in changing these things, and the kind of the ways that they're used and the salience of when and how they're pulled, if you will, is also ever changing and never really ceases. So let's kind of break down what each of these things are. So transing care, communization of care, if you ignore all the lines on the slide, is basically at the highest level is decentering the nuclear family from the responsibility for the provision of care. All right. So it's about decentering assumptions around care, that it is that of the family. It cannot. So, and really what this does is this also resists kind of that white middle class bourgeoisie understanding of care that occurs in the context of that nuclear family with two, a mom, a dad, two kids, and a dog, right? It's about reaching beyond those that are part of even our larger community. This is a really important piece too. It's about reaching beyond even those that we regard as our chosen family or our intimates. It's about moving beyond those that we know and extending to strangers of whom, it's described, we are socially consubstantial, which means like we're sharing this where there's differences, right? But we have this shared experience. So really, it's about reaching across difference, and I'll talk more about that coming up. But I thought that Azura's quote here about communization of care and decentering the nuclear family, leaning into vulnerability was particularly salient, especially in light of some of the other work I've had the fortune and privilege of doing with Dr. SR and Dr. Lundgren and others on the call. But more recently, I've begun thinking about this not as the communization of care, but of vulnerability. Vulnerability itself, the need for care, is basic, endless, and real. We need to embrace vulnerability and its differential logics if we are to survive these times. And I feel like the heightened level of trans antagonism and the current levels of vulnerability are very real right now. Very real. The second practice that is included in this assemblage is that of mutual aid. So really a mutual aid, according to Dean Spade, is the communal coordination to meet collective needs. And it's derived from awareness that the systems that are in place not only don't meet our needs, but often in fact are, compound the conditions that deny those needs. And that's actually by design. So that's a really important thing. Mutual aid's not new. Historically, people have worked together collaboratively, to survive across the span of human history. Humans, again, are naturally interdependent. It's only been since the introduction of colonialist and capitalist systems and their corresponding structures that we've really changed the ways in which we connect and share resources to survive. These systems instilled structures that have been predicated on wage labor and competition, which work together to manufacture a sense of scarcity, and by extension dramatically have jeopardized our ability to connect, relate, and share resources. So mutual aid in many ways is an answer to that, right? It's looking at kind of that communal coordination. It's about building shared understanding. It's about solidarity, not charity. This is key. And I'll tell you what, I've had to read through this a few times as somebody who works kind of in a social services sector. It is not charity, and social services aid, things like that, relief are often considered charity. And that typically charity differentiates itself from mutual aid in that charity is normally sits with areas where there's concentrated wealth or power, and for people to make decisions about who, what, and how much charity or support one is deserving of or entitled to receive. And that's, based on typically eligibility criteria, right? So examples of that abound, whether that's in philanthropic, nonprofit sectors, faith-based, or government administrated. We see kind of that charity. I could name a lot of programs right now. I will not. Mutual aid, in contrast, is really an integral part of our lives. It's not just a hobby or a pet cause. It resists that application of eligibility criteria, and it leverages and involves the collective as opposed to a small group of subject matter experts, right? It promotes a shared analysis of the root problem of causes, and it connects people to social movements intended to address those causes. So there's three key elements of mutual aid that include, fulfilling survival needs and building that common understanding about why people don't have what they need. It's about mobilizing people, expanding that solidarity, and developing and forging movements. And finally, it's participatory. It's inclusive, to say an outlawed word these days. Problem solving occurs through the collective action rather than waiting for saviors, or again, thinking about kind of that small group of experts, or that one big leader, right? The third piece or practice that falls within trans and care is really about trans ethical wisdoms. And what this is Amy Marvin not kind of reconceptualized this based on Sarah Ruddock's work, who is a famed feminist care scholar who talks about mothering. But really, what she's able to kind of rework here is that Transethical Wisdoms is really about solidarity across difference. And this is one that I've talked a little bit about before and kind of alluded to. This is where we really see this show up. So the Star House, which is an acronym for what was the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which was founded and led by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson, was basically an organization, if you will, that sought to care for trans youth on the street via providing housing, food, clothing, and actually even schooling later on. And Star House, sought funding from the Gay Liberation Foundation and one of the other kind of ones of that time, and basically was denied. And consequently, they were shut down. And they were not able to provide the services in an ongoing fashion for these young trans youth. And Rivera and Johnson really called that out. And what they did was they called out to like the Gay Liberation Foundation, some of these other kind of, more mainstream, if you will, at the time, movements towards gay liberation, right? And said, hey, we've been with you this whole time. We've been fighting. We're on the front lines of, the gay rights movement and liberation movement for you. Where the hell are you guys, right? So it's anchored by this recognition of how many trans youth are rejected by their families and thus end up on the street, right? And need and receive care from the larger communities of queer and trans elders, as well as through mutual caregiving. It's a specific political wisdom and care ethic that emerges, and it's one that is coalitional and contextual among trans communities and other marginalized communities. In other words, what we often talk about today is intersectional community building, right? So trans in care and trans ethical wisdom see value and understanding and being coalitional and building across and centering intersectionality in that community building. It centers solidarity across difference. I've talked about this a few times. That's a big key. It really understands the link between on the ground solidarity and dependency. And it sees trans as situational, not as a monolith. This is a key piece of that as well, because it doesn't look to gloss over and homogenize, the trans population. Instead, it says that our solidarity comes in our shared dependency. Again, harkening back to this idea of interdependency overall, right? What we know about care and human flourishing and survival. The next practice that we have is an infrapolitical ethics of care. And so in contrast to a prescribed set of ethical rules or kind of predetermined morals, which is something that we see within the context of religion, neoliberalism, right? Many of our kind of sociocultural underpinnings or logics, what we have here is an ethos that's really derived from the collective practice, right? It's the practices of doing and the subsequent norms and principles that are produced as a result of that practice. So therefore, this idea being if we shift the practice, then we actually shift the ethos. So practices of care are always part of an emergent ethos, precisely because it is that embodied and material actions of labor, meaning the practice themselves, through which care is realized, that is then thus like central to our ways of doing. So here, Malatino borrows from James Scott, conjoining the term infrapolitics to ethics of care to explicitly position care ethics, meaning the embodied person-to-person practices of assistance and support that foster capacities for personal and communal flourishing, as integral to any political movement in a way that disrupts any rending of the private from the public. So again, that theme of thinking about how we disrupt private from public, because ultimately trans in care it does lean into that. Many forms of embodied and material care labor that range from ensuring basic needs are met to providing the critical emotional care necessary after profoundly negative affective experiences that are pretty routine in trans folks' lives, that circulate among and through an interdependent, beloved community and which facilitate intracommunal survival and cultivate cultivate the resilience necessary to enable political resistance. So when we talk about that infrapolitical ethics of care, we're thinking about what does this look like in trans lives? At this point in time, it is the practices that we do just to enable each other's ongoing survival. Because our ongoing survival, if you will, is a political statement just in and of itself, right? If this is, the idea of joining, our care ethics as part of that political movement, and joining that to the politics, are providing care so that our survival is that act of political resistance in and of itself right now. And then the last practice included is what we call T for T. Trans for Trans is a praxis of love. So T for T is actually shorthand and developed on the pages of Craigslist, believe it or not. Always fun when we can hearken some type of academic crap to Craigslist and the internet, right? But it's come a long way from T for T from the days of Craigslist, where it was used basically as a way to advertise for personals that got around the man for man or man for woman or woman for woman, or because trans has always been positioned as other. And in some ways it still kind of does that. There's a piece of separatism that accompanies it, but T for T praxis of love is really the complex, messy, and difficult praxis of coalitional relationality between trans people that's predicated on love across difference to ensure our survival, right? So it's an understanding that we cannot homogenize what it is to be trans, and it really shines a light on the differences within and among trans community, even when that is uncomfortable. Ultimately, it can serve as a blueprint for survival of trans becoming through the small acts demonstrative of love and commitment that trans folks have to one another, and that make life more bearable via being with, witnessing, and holding up a mirror to one another. I have a lot of T for T in my life. There's in fact even somebody on this webinar, I don't know if he's still here, but he routinely sends me some hand-drawn cards that he doesn't know are sitting right over there. And I've had the fortune of being able to connect with a wide range of folks and really engage in T for T. And I'm super grateful for that, and really can hold on to that practice for sure. So with all that, the purpose of the study really is, and I'm positioning it as a post-intentional phenomenological study, which I'll talk about more in a second, is really to explore American transgender adults' lived experiences through transing care. That is the deliberate and intentional acts of actively navigating, learning, and continuously weaving and reweaving the intimate, familial, and domestic aspects of one's care web in, among, across, and through the interconnected networks of the trans community via an assemblage of embodied practices and material enactment of an infrapolitical ethics of care, mutual aid, the communization of care, trans ethical wisdoms, and a T for T praxis of love. So there's a couple of things that I really, again, kind of want to call attention to here. I have positioned this as a post-intentional phenomenological study on purpose, and that's, I'll get to that in a second, but I want to call out the word of the use through. So transgender adults lived experiences through transing care. And I just want to align that because, again, as we've talked about, care is ever ongoing, right? And transing care is something that's also ongoing. It's not something that's static, that has a start and stop. It's messy. We don't know where it begins. We don't necessarily know where it ends. And that's ultimately because it doesn't. So we really want to resist the temptation to to kind of draw those conclusions and really just explore what this phenomena is of living through transing care. To that end, the research question currently as it's proposed is, what are American transgender adults' lived experiences through transing care? I do not have a conceptual framework at this point. I think I have some ideas. They may even toy with some generative learning that I think is the more and more that I read about post-intentional phenomenology, the more and more I think that generative learning may be a theory that I want to think with relative to post-intentional phenomenology, and thinking about transing care as a concept to explore overall. So my proposed methodology is post-intentional phenomenology, which really seeks to blend phenomenological and post-structural philosophies, and in doing so resist either or logics and or what each of those philosophies is or is not. So it really is meant to traverse the seemingly oppositional chasm between phenomenology's assumption of a subject's relative stability and post-structuralism's assumption of a subject's inherent instability by putting these ideas together and see what happens. So again, this is also an example in my mind of assemblage and an alignment of the same way that we see trans and care as an assemblage. I want to note here, phenomenology can be a slippery slope, particularly when we think about phenomenology and descriptive phenomenology, which is really the study of lived experience or the study of lived experience as it relates to the essence of something, or which we often see essentialized. And as a trans person, that is a very scary place to go. Why? Because we see essentialism, gender essentialism, particularly get weaponized against us as a means to justify the trans antagonism and transphobia that is perpetuated. So it gets leveraged as, you know, a means to say, no, you can only be a woman if you X, Y, and Z. It's that essentialist viewpoint, which is really, so I will be honest, I've really struggled with coming to phenomenology, but finally was able to find my way through Wegel's post-intentional phenomenology. So phenomenologically speaking, a big piece of phenomenology typically is around intentionality, and phenomenologically speaking, intentionality is not about the American or English connotation of that, meaning someone's objectives, like subjective, like purpose or intended purposes or objectives, but instead is really about, it's intended to know how humans are connected to the world, and is reflective of how meaning comes to be in the context of relation. So again, this really aligns with kind of like how I understand and view the world. It also occurs in the in-between spaces, the spaces where individuals find themselves intentionally in relation with others in the world. This is also a key alignment for me because that's so much of what being trans is about. Like, listen, we can all, like when I talked about earlier about transness as that of becoming, right? And understanding that one's transness is not a state of being, but rather one of becoming, because when you begin to transition, you transition for the rest of your life, regardless of whether you're following the medical, you know, teleologies and taking hormones for the rest of your life. The reality is you're continuously always living through that. At least that's my understanding of trans. And so I feel like for those folks in particular who are kind of like living in that in-between space where maybe our gendered acknowledgement or legibility isn't perceived by those external to us, we're living in this space. And that often happens for those of us that are like at varying degrees of medical transition. You kind of like live in this lag time. There's a transnormative structure, if you will, that where we're kind of living in this lag time where you feel like you're kind of living in between. And even for me, some days, like I feel like that still, right? Like as each day passes, the longer that I've engaged in medical transition, the more I begin to pass. I had a couple buddies who I hadn't talked to in a while, like literally say to me last night, your voice has dropped so much. And I'm like, oh, I can't hear it anymore. But everything happens so much in that in-between time. And so I think that that's an important piece and part of what I really resonates for me about phenomenology. And when we think really about post phenomenology, it reworks that intentionality, right? So the work of post-intentional phenomenology occurs in that in-between space of post-structuralist ideas like Deleuze and Guattari's lines of flight and multiplicities, and phenomenology, where we look at stories that are and understand those as fluid and continuously in flux, and the knowledge is conceived and understood as incomplete, contextually situated, continuously deferred, and circulating in, among, and through those relations, right? Which make the entry points into stories not something that is direct at a beginning or end, and really like kind of blurs those lines between the narrator and narratee, if you will. So as I really think through this, like thinking with kind of lines of flight, part of what Weigel talks about here is reworking that intentionality from looking at intentionality as what things are to how things connect. This is crucial as that moves us away from that kind of idea of essence that I was just talking about is really scary as a trans person. And it moves us away from the assumption that a phenomena has an essence and a corresponding stability, and moves us toward examining a phenomena through an intentionality that considers how those things connect, and thus destabilizes that intentionality as connections exist but are ever-changing, partial, and multiple. Intentionality really kind of gets reconceptualized and conceived as less of a consciousness and more in terms of the cultured, gendered, and embodied embodiment in which the body is lived through and permeated by by kind of social experiences. So leading to an understanding that all threads of meaning run through our relations are both being constructed, deconstructed, blurred, disrupted. In other words, it's a both and. And I think that that's the other thing that really draws me to vagal and post-intentional phenomenology is that concept of both and instead of either or, because if there's anything that I know about living as trans, it's all about both and it's never about either or. As we think about multiplicity subjects, the subject basically is viewed as not linear. I think as we think about, transitioning for trans folks, that's never linear either, even though there's often a progressive timeline that's put out there, right? Like that assumes that there is one. There really isn't. And that's because so much of being trans is both in the eyes of the perceiver as well as those of us that are being perceived. And I think, the other through lines here, like post-intentional phenomenology, the phenomena is seen as multiple partial contextual influx and simultaneously producing and being produced. And to me, that is the experience of both transing care and of living through being trans. Transness is that state of becoming. It happens in the in-between, at the margins, in that lag time. It's synonymous with this assemblage thinking. We talk about medical technologies as being, processes of assemblage. There's a lot about that relative to trans studies, although arguably cis people are just as assembled when we think about kind of what those experiences are across social and how the social cultural conditions and experiences also contribute to that assemblage. Cis people experience the same there. Care happens in the embodied practices. In the context of relations, it's forever ongoing and always in flux. So again, care itself as a phenomena, as well as this concept of transing care, I think are well aligned here. And transing care is that assemblage of practices that are put together where transness can occur in spaces between, the government divestment and familial abandonment in response to that heightened precarity. So in terms of participant recruitment, this is all kind of like fledgling ideas, like 5 to 8 participants. I will do a purposive network, sampling, snowballing. I will borrow my trans network and ask them to recruit for me, essentially. As a trans person, data collection is really, developing that post-reflection plan, doing that first post-reflection, creating my post-reflection journal, doing that first, kind of post-reflection journaling and doing that throughout the process of data collection, thinking about data collection as unstructured interviews, as well as, honestly, the other thing I love about post-intentional phenomenology is it allows you to draw from more than just interviews. It even suggests arts-based formed and other relevant artifacts and key data, which to me just screams for me to go on social media. So any of you who know my first iterations and my love of internet memes, you can bet that I'm like, oh, maybe I can look at some internet memes, or if nothing else, certainly the numerous posts requesting mutual aid that are shared and circulated in amongst the trans network on social media pretty consistently. So kind of looking at some broader data collection beyond just interviews, and then data analysis really being rooted in that post-intentional phenomenological a process of deconstructing the wholes of phenomenological material, thinking with theory, and analyzing the post-reflections, and then developing the text itself. So again, in progress, finally, post-potential significance from a practice standpoint. Listen, any chance I have to trash neoliberal capitalism, I will. So as neoliberal capitalism and the American oligarchy further entrench themselves and widespread precarity becomes the norm, the need for a social movement that centers empathy and compassion, one in which we move beyond identity politics to one of coalitional politics where we find solidarity and connection across difference is needed now more than ever. It's my contention that there's something to be learned about how to forge that movement through trans adults' lived experiences through transing care. From a research perspective, the field of trans studies, as well as HOL, lacks empirical works that explore what it feels like to be trans, what transgender people individually may or may not desire, and the qualitative experiences and meanings of trans life, especially as it relates to the ways in which transness interacts with other identities. And quite frankly, much of the empirical work about trans lived experiences has been conducted by non-trans people and is situated within fields of counseling, therapy, and medical and public health. And this study will contribute to a field of empirical work that is performed by trans people and will explore phenomena beyond the fields that typically tend to pathologize transness, which I'm not a fan of. And that's where we're at for now. I made it, Dr. SR, 61 minutes. We were a little concerned.
Just a little. So there's a lot there to process. Like I said, it's a very sort of fluid and complex set of ideas and a phenomenon and real life experiences that DJ's trying to integrate in this study, as well as their own his own positionality. So I just would like to open it up for any comment or questions at this point. We've got about 25 minutes. Reactions?
DJ, thank you very much for sharing. I mean, wow, it's a lot. I mean, it captured it all: complex, complicated, chaotic. I mean, it's got all the context there. What I wonder, because and really appreciate, and it's difficult, which is you have to do a lot of educating the dumb audience, of which I am one, before you can even enter the conversation. It just feels like that. And I wonder, as you're preparing for your research, how to find another way in, right? Which will foreground the inquiry and background the advocacy. And I'm not saying that it's so important to be advocate and to share with us the language of advocacy, particularly as you're exploring these, contexts side by side, right? So I just wanted to name that and share that on me, it lands in a way that I really want to be reminded of the inquiry, because your attempt to explore something that, and I'm going to use very bad language here, which is it's not meant to fit. The industrial modernist context does not want you specifically and the context of trans to fit. It doesn't fit. So what are the side doors or the underground tunnels or the, flowers that you might have to bring or forward so that the inquiry can take place with all of us included? Does that make sense, DJ? Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's
you can't prove to this context that the trans context fits, because that is not the fit. There is no fat. There's no fit. There's no fix. Maybe a better word to say. There is no fix. So now what? And I wonder how might that stimulate another way in to the inquiry?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, Dr. Aliki. I was actually thinking about that after I got off the phone with Dr. SR this morning, who was like, "Where's your slides? It's 10 o'clock. I haven't seen them." And I'm like, I I was thinking about it, and because she was like, "There's so much information here, like you're gonna overwhelm people." And I'm like thinking to myself, "Yeah, but dude, I have to explain all this to you. You don't get half of it. No offense, Dr. SR. Like, I like." So that's part of like that is part of my challenge, I guess, at this point. Like, and I don't know. Like, this is quite frankly the challenge of being part of a marginalized group, right? Like for me, coming from a personal standpoint, if we just want to talk about it within an institutional context, 98% of the, faculty out here are not trans. I don't have a single, like we talked about whether or not I need to have a trans person on my
Committee.
committee. And like the answer is yes,
Yeah.
actually, because then, you know, that person can look at the rest of my committee and go, nope, you don't get to comment on this part.
We lost,
Sorry,
yeah.
because we understand that you don't go to your own education.
Yeah. So from a thinking with complexity, right? Or thinking with generative knowing or thinking with these, ideas, I wonder what the inquiry really is.
Mhm.
And how might we find, or you find another way in. And, like, for example, the question that came to my mind as you were speaking was like, oh, what is, what is care now? Right? Like, what is care in a changing world, right? And to use that sort of, I don't know, it's suffix, I guess it would be. And I wonder, do you know what I'm saying? Like, what's the sideways entry? And then in your document, of course, you're going to have an incredible literature review, but also a context chapter. You're going to need an extra chapter that says, oh, by the way, I need to bring forward what this means now in the context of a world that, doesn't really receive or allow, right? So just FYI, you'll have to write about it, but how do you speak about it in a way that, maybe the download is something that has to happen differently. So that I'm just playing with you, but that's what it occurred, just to give, maybe that might be an interesting way to explore.
It's
Yeah.
like, yes, and there is, and it's funny because I've actually written some of those pieces relative to the context, which is the whole language piece, which
Mhm.
I didn't articulate well here for all the reasons that we just talked about, right? Which is that then we get lost in that part. Um, and that was part of what Dr. SRI and I talked about this morning. But yeah, I do understand relative to that
I want to.
Yeah,
context. I still think
we've talked about this in another way, DJ, as well. If you recall, in terms of the significance, right? That it's so severe and so threatening to lack the care networks in the trans community. But that there's the neoliberal dynamic that also thwarts and prevents care in other sectors of society, right? So the notion of care and care networks, while is an issue of survival it's a question of survival for the trans community. It's also important for us to understand it, because the fabric of care is such that has been worn away for everybody in some degree, right? So I think it's really sort of, it's not either or, right? It's either we bring forward the context or we bring forward the inquiry. It's how to integrate it in a way that it's a challenge. It's a challenge, not just for you, but for any researcher that's going to be taking on an issue of grave personal importance, or it's really, is there research and advocacy? Is there advocacy and research, right? And how do we integrate it in a way that we do justice to both, right? And any suggestions from anybody here on how to do that in the context of this study, we're all ears.
I'd like to jump in real briefly, DJ. The enthusiasm and passion as you speak is really wonderful. It's really engaging, and I found myself really kind of I learned a lot. Number one, and maybe with Aliki, I'm going to put myself in the dumb crowd, but also a very, very curious crowd. And as a teacher and a teacher educator, one of the aspects of care or practices of care, which I wonder it might have some place in the schemas and the various frameworks and intersecting positionalities that you're discussing, and then again maybe not. But a lot of the public-private battle around care for me happens in classrooms, and as a teacher educator, thinking about what we do as teachers, and I mean here in this very environment, we're in an academic setting. There's an aspect of that potentially doesn't get theorized, much less sort of articulated enough. It's something that I try to do in my practice, and in and around transing is part of what I do, but certainly not the way you're doing it as a cisgender white man. I come from a very different positionality in some respects, but I see intersections with my students who are on the autism spectrum and the way that they learn to talk about and recognize their differences and their sort of exclusionary, the way society excludes them from the story of care. So I'm not sure where this actually leads, but I just wanted to say I was very captivated by your enthusiasm and by your wrestling with the language and wrestling with the intersectionalities that you're discussing. And at the very end, maybe make a suggestion possibly towards Aliki's comment. I find myself personally really gravitating to moments of almost like scenarios of concrete materiality around, like your buddy mentioning that your voice had dropped. And, it's such a minor, small sort of thing, but it really kind of immediately was an enacted moment of material structure that went beyond the systems really and spoke very carefully and sincerely, very sensitively about the lived experience. So anyway, I don't know if any of that is of any use to you in terms of the journey, but my God, really, thank you so much. It's really, really encouraging. Thank you for this work. And Ellen, thank you, and Laliki and everybody who's been part of your team. This is amazing, really amazing.
Thanks, Sean. I didn't your comment about the public-private playing out in the classroom, like, cool. Yeah, that hits. Just thinking about like all the bills for parental rights and forced outing and all of those pieces that do align with some of this consideration and what's considered care and not. So
DJ, I have a question, comment, but I want to ask a clarifying question before we see what this turns into. So in terms of your study, you are actually going to talk to other people that are in the trans community, right? Okay,
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that because I wanted to speak to Quincy's comment and I wanted to speak to something that kind of was like kind of dancing in my head as you were talking, right? Because I think there's something to be said about the nuclear family because like that is an idea that like is upheld by I think that is a white like heteronormative idea, but I don't think that that's one that's shared in other like minoritized communities. So I'm really interested to see the places that that'll come up in difference, especially if you talk to people who are parts of other minoritized groups. So you have minoritized minorities. And so I'm wondering like where you'll find like similarities and differences in that. And then the places where you trade on privilege and the places that you won't. I mean, I think to your point about like, and I think to your point about kind of getting to this place where people are kind of encountering you in a new way is something that's really interesting. And so I think that would be something that is going to be interesting to kind of see. And that could be outside of family. That could be in terms of like friend groups. And I think that also could be in like new spaces where you don't have to announce it, but you can choose to or not. So I think that would be something that would be interesting. And I think that other piece that I was wondering about is like, I think in terms of, I'm curious about how, I think on the front end, there's always all this explaining that we have to do because the thing isn't done yet. So we're talking about these ideas of like what we think will be there. Because to what Dr. Ali said earlier, I'm wondering if the stories that you get will help you do something with the framing so that like some of the commentary that you have, you'll layer in the stories that you have, like you layer in the storytelling, if that makes sense, and like how you're interpreting what it is you get. Because I would assume, I'm assuming, right, that, you know, there's a possibility that you'll be talking to people who have like transitioned in different places. And again, like there'll be different elements to the things that they're going to call safety. And it's just, I do think that like when you have the story is going to be easier for you to be able to give the context. Because right now it's just, I'm giving you context because that's what I have versus here are these stories and I'm illustrating it through that. Right. And so what a whole bunch of other people on this call have said, I think that storytelling part is the piece that's going to make this palatable, right? For lack of a better word. But I mean that to say like people are really going to understand what you're saying because you're telling human stories versus kind of talking about in this researchy theoretical way.
I love that.
Yeah, I want to echo what Cecilia just offered. I think, you know, and Sean's putting on it, like your passion is really is like the sensation of it is really important and not to lose it. And I wonder if there's is there a story? Is there a provocative question? Like, I think we need a sideways door. And I'm happy to keep thinking on this with you without eliminating the potency of the education piece, right? You know what I was imagining, DJ? Remember in the good old days when you had the big Lego set behind you? What was it? Like it seemed to be like a whole universe that you had behind you. I can't remember. Do you remember? It was during COVID. What was it?
It was actually the Hogwarts castle, which
That's right.
ironic. I took out of here. Why? Because Harry Potter's author, J.K. Rowling, is one of the biggest trans-exclusionary radical feminists out there.
I get it. So let's just bracket that part. And I wonder, like, what's the puzzle that you can present? Just like the visual puzzle, because this is a sensory puzzle to bring forward to us because it is so hard for us to be in relationship with it. I mean, that's the truth, right? So I wonder if there's a couple of things, and you know, ways in. That's kind of where my head is going right now.
Well, Mike, I could probably drop about 15 internet memes right now that would give you a sense of it, but
So, go ahead.
I just know, I appreciate the feedback and like thinking through it relative to, yeah, what is the sideways door? I mean, to open with some of the stories, like, I think would make a difference. I mean, maybe I don't know, maybe the avenue then is like pulling from some trans memoirs that talk about some of these experiences and or from some of like there's a couple of good novels right now that are that like fiction, like pulling from trans fiction written by trans authors that talk about trans experience in the context of that fiction. Like I'm thinking about like, so I don't know, maybe that's a potential.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, DJ. I really do. It's almost like even putting the vignettes together, I think is a really good way in.
But I wonder if you tell your own story, DJ.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, yeah, I think, yeah. I, that's complicated. And here's why. And it comes right back to our advocacy issue, right? Like, because I don't necessarily or didn't I didn't necessarily follow a very transnormative path, at least as is understood by most of the cisgender population.
But isn't that the point?
Yeah.
Anyway, DJ, you don't need to resolve this now, right? This is not a question to be answered in this moment. These are ideas to kick around, right? And to see what resonates, right? To see what kind of gives you a little pause and helps you think a little differently or deeply about how you want to share your work, right? That's what we're here for, right? Just to have a conversation. And I'm sure any of the folks here engaged with you now would be open to exploring further ideas with you. As am I. I think there's some really great suggestions here of how not to let go of the richness of these real material concepts that you're dealing with, right? That you're using to educate us, but present them in a way that tells a story that's engaging and leads to inquiry, right? So it's really a synthesis exercise, right? Which, but from you're synthesizing the human story with the analytical framework, right?
I really liked, I don't know if you saw it, DJ, Catherine Lombardozzi's comment about that cis people just can't get inside the head of somebody who's trans. My grandchild who's trans talks about being just exhausted trying to talk to people across the line, right? Or to pass, to talk to somebody who's doesn't get it, right? And so the stories, I think you're really trying to cross that bridge to help people get it, right? To see inside the way somebody thinks who lives a life of trans.
Yeah. I thank you, Dr. Watkins. I did see, yeah.
And I can echo and expand a little bit. I've been part of a writing group recently, and I went to a class that was really about memoir writing. And one of the members of the class was telling the story of his manic depression from inside his manic depression. It was the most, I've never heard it explained that way, and never able to feel it, see it, understand it. Clinically, you can understand it. You get what you see on the outside. But for him to be able to put language around what it felt like from his perspective, what he was seeing, and why he was doing the things he was doing was just really an amazing, it just provided amazing insights into what that condition is like. And that's a mental health condition. Yours is not a mental health condition, but still, the point remains that giving voice to those stories is going to be incredibly powerful. So the starkness of your research question, just I loved it. I loved it. What is that? What is that experience like? That's what we want to know. And you're going at it from a very rich perspective. I mean, just so many angles to explore and to think about. I just think it's going to be a really powerful piece of work when it's done.
Mhm.
So here, Dr. Aliki, speaking of, you're like, we need a way in. If you all are talking about my own story, this was a cartoon that I drew of kind of some of my experiences from like when I was little, like things that I can recall now, right? Like, and this was obviously before I shaved my head, you guys, and grew my hair, like got rid of my, for those who don't know me, I used to have a blonde mohawk. So,
Uh-huh.
but this is essentially like current me talking to little me, if you will, like
It's so powerful.
thinking about all these experiences, like, I don't know, maybe art makes a comeback, Dr. SR.
Yeah, some ways in, and it could be, it's not, it's like multiple ways in, right? I mean, you're lines of flight. Give us, we all need lines of flight, lots of lines of flight in order to enter the possibility of being in relationship to this kind of thinking. Because very few of us, remember how hard it was for me to get they, them? Remember in the, like, you need to teach, you have to like school me on that. It's like,
Mhm. It seems to me that there's, like you said, lines of flight. I mean, I think that might be a way to start thinking about these very complex interplay of ideas and experiences, right? In terms of if we assemble it this way, this is how we might inquire. If we assemble it this way, this might be how it it manifests itself, right? So maybe that's a way into maybe that's the way in. And of course, any line of flight that you want to set out is always just a moment in time construct, right? To see where it heads, right?
Yeah.
and I think it's also the humility that the reality is that we don't understand because we're so in the paradigm of separation. We are not in the paradigm of, we talk a good talk about interdependence. We don't know how that feels or how to even walk it or be it. We talk at it as if it's a thing out there. And I think you have to help us. All the studies that are coming down, particularly in this context, really, they are going to be powerful because you're inviting us into new ways to relate in a world that has made it difficult to relate in that way.
Yeah.
I love that we're here, and I wonder whether it's time to just bring a pause and perhaps allow for what's come to kind of, trickle in and trickle through. And I know we've recorded this session, and Young-Hyun will take care of that recording and share it with you, DJ, so that you have this in a transcript form. And, this is just the beginning, and I'm so grateful that you invited us into this beginning.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me at the Generative Learning Complexity Lab. I appreciate it. And sometimes I have to be forced to do things, deadlines, organization, executive functioning are not my friends. So forcing me to do something like this is always pretty helpful. So, because then it gives me deadlines.
All right. Well, DJ, Ellen, thank you for being here with all of us and for sharing this really powerful work. It's good to
thank
have
you.
something that kind of stretches our brains.
Yes,
And,
you all
and
for
thank you,
joining today and
yeah, thank you.
back. This has been, the lab is such a great thinking space. I really appreciate the community that you're building here and being a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you all so
Ellen.
much.